our year-end special edition of World 360 2024, a year of conflict. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Whether it's the wars in Middle East, Ukraine, or regime changes in Bangladesh and Syria, or the resurgence of the Khalistan terror threat, we'll discuss the major wars and conflicts that dominated 2024, exploring their progression and far-reaching implications. The year began with Russia continuing its 2022 war against Ukraine in a purported move to stop the NATO expansion towards its borders. 3 months earlier, in October 2023, the militant group Hamas had launched an assault in Gaza. As a result, it killed more than 1,000 people, triggering massive retaliation from Israel against Palestine. As the war raged on, Israel extending embassies is one. Houthi rebels in Yemen intercepted and attacked ships and other vessels they identified as aiding Israel. Hezbollah militants in Lebanon exchanged fire with Israel's paging devices, killing dozens and injuring hundreds in a spiraling regional escalation. A ceasefire deal in November cooled regional tensions. However, Syrian rebels launched lightning offensives against the Iran-backed Assad government and toppled his regime, triggering a fresh bout of violence. With the victory of Donald Trump in November's U.S. presidential polls, Ukraine's much-needed American backing is liable to change. This marks a turning point in the war. Meanwhile, the Iranian proxies stand weakened in the region, allowing Israel the space to further strengthen its regional position. We take a look at how these international conflicts and others have evolved through the year. On that note, let me introduce our guests today. I'm joined in by Michael Kugelman, who is an American foreign policy author and expert specializing in South Asia. I'm also joined in by Professor Brahmachelani, who is a leading geostrategy expert. Michael, if I could begin with you, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, which is ACLED database, has now shown that half of the death toll from the current conflict situation. How do you see this shaping up in 2025?
Conflict, and I think what's particularly concerning is that the instability in the Middle East, which had with the war, prone to some more this year. So that's concerning, and indeed the fact that the war continued to grind is. And I'm glad you Myanmar, because I think that many globally, including in this country, in the U.S., forget about just how serious a conflict you have there, and that is something that could have significant spillover implications for Bangladesh and for India. And I would also add the fact that the scale of humanitarian humanitarian crisis has grown over the last year. You have Afghanistan as well. There's no war playing out in Afghanistan now, but you have serious levels of humanitarian stress. I think that, looking to what to expect next year, one thing I would say is that we, of course, have a new incoming president here in the U.S., and Donald Trump is someone who has given every indication that he wants to do everything he can to try to help end these wars, particularly the war in Ukraine and in Gaza. This is someone who does not want the U.S. to get dragged into conflict or military adventurism. Since he will be the president of a global superpower, I think that if he is serious about trying to push to get these wars to end, which won't be easy, that is still very significant. And if we want to look for, one possible positive note to look for next year, it's that we may see a pitch from the new U.S. president to try to help end two terrible wars.
Michael, that's in fact something that I'm going to be deep diving into, because many have called this also as the year of Donald Trump. But Professor Brahmachelani, the Global Peace Index has revealed that 2024 has been the year of maximum conflicts since World War II. Is this a result of a failure of multilateral diplomacy?
We are living in fraught times, and the fraught times indicate that different systems. The US-led post-World War II order is giving way to a new global order whose contours are still not clearly visible. So in this transition period, we're seeing some very important trends in the world. The first trend is the world is changing towards multipolarity. Instead of one power dominating, a multipolar world is emerging. The second very important trend is that rivalries between the major powers have again become central to international relations. Now, all these crises, conflicts that we are seeing, including the wars, these are raging because of major powers. They're involved in these crises and conflicts. They're not peacemakers. They are adding fuel or to the fire, or they're directly involved in the crises, conflicts, and wars. And then the third trend that we are seeing is rising protectionism. As global tensions rise, countries are increasingly embracing protectionist and nationalist economic policies. We'll see more of that in the US under Donald Trump.
Right.
So, this populism that we are seeing in the West and in developing world.
Michael, when we talk about multilateralism, what's been your assessment of the UN in the current atmosphere, where the world is hyper-polarized, bloc versus Eastern Bloc polarization?
That's a great list of multilateralism. And this is playing out globally for sure, but also regionally, including in India's neighborhood. And I think that Dr. Chilani has already laid this out. I mean, this crisis of multilateralism, I see it being tied to or caused by a number of factors. One is intensifying great power competition, which means it's hard for the world's top two powers to work together and in larger groups to tackle major global challenges. You also have fraught relations between so many countries, and you also have rising forms of nationalism that encourage isolationism. And I think that the fact that this crisis of multilateralism is happening now is dangerous, because the biggest, or many of the biggest global challenges these days require multilateral solutions. We're talking about pandemics, we're talking about conflicts, and we're talking about climate change. And again, as Dr. Chilani said before, I think that the world is really evolving in ways that cry out for more multilateralism. He had said that it's becoming a more multipolar world. I agree. That means that if you have so many different poles emerging, they need to be working together more.
All right. Now, Michael, let me quickly come to the point that you were earlier making right at the beginning as far as Donald Trump is concerned. Even when wars end, peace doesn't always last. And that's why I want to ask you, is Donald Trump's vow to end wars easier said than done?
Well, absolutely, and for many reasons. One is that the parties to the wars have to be willing to be susceptible to third-party efforts. And when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, I really don't know if Putin and Zelensky are ready to sit down. I think that we may have to be talking about something more long-term. So I think it's going to be very difficult. And I would also say this about Mr. Trump. I mean, he's someone that seems to want to end wars, but he has not. We've seen, as we all know, when he was president the first time, U.S. relations with some of its closest allies, Europe in particular, bills for alliances and things like that. And it's actually a bit ironic that I think in some contexts, rivals of America are more happy about Trump's coming back to power than are some of America's top allies. So, I think these things are linked. Yes, it would be It is encouraging if it's true that he wants to try to help end these wars, but that requires a lot of diplomacy. It involves a lot of difficult, working together with a number of different players, and that's where it's unclear where he would want to go. I would just very quickly say to the point about the UN. I think we have to give credit to the UN as one of the only multilateral forums that has been able to bring together both the developed world, and the global South to discuss key issues of global concern, particularly climate change. The UN Climate Summit happens every year. This year's was a bit tough. It didn't give the outcome that many wanted, but you'd still know that every year you will have key countries, the global South, the developed world, talking about issues that impact everyone. And I think that is something that needs to be given credit. The UN deserves some credit for that.
Professor Chilani, let's talk about what Donald Trump had to say in the Times interview that he's given. Remember, Times has also called him the person of the year. He's saying that anything can be expected from his second term, even the possibility of a war against Iran.
One has to separate his rhetoric from policy, as we saw in the first term. He's a wily businessman who seeks to increase his bargaining power by making threats, but his threats usually are never translated into action. But he uses this kind of leverage for extracting concessions to advance US economic and strategic interests. But I think his biggest task, the biggest task that is being handed over to Trump by Joe Biden, is this emerging US-China axis. Russia-China axis. This Russia-China strategic axis is the legacy of Biden presidency. China and Russia are not natural allies, they're natural competitors. Biden policies have brought China and Russia closer together. And this has major implications for American security, Akansha, for the simple reason that the US won the Cold War, not militarily, but geopolitically, by driving a wedge between China and Russia. It co-opted China in the second half of the Cold War to turn this into a 2-against-1 competition that ultimately led to Soviet imperial overstretch. But now a 2-against-1 competition is returning, but with the US at the receiving end. And Trump's task will be to break this axis. It means he has to improve relations with Russia.
Professor Chelani, I'm so sorry to interrupt you there. In fact, I just want to quickly wrap up with your thoughts on how do you see India's Canada policy shape up in the days ahead. Remember, the Canadian government's asylum policies for militants and terrorists from India have already been an alarming issue, condemnable to say the least.
Is that question to me or to me?
Yes, Professor Chelani.
Well, there is some silver lining on the horizon, which is that Trudeau's days seem numbered. Under Trudeau, as we all know, relations between Canada and India have suffered terribly. And thanks to Trump's threat to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian exports to the US, there is a crisis in Canada within the ruling Liberal Party. And there are calls within the ruling party for Trudeau to leave. Once there is a change of government in Canada, the effort to repair the Canada-India relationship can begin. But I think the larger issue of Canada and the US becoming the global epicenters of the Khalistan movement, of these two countries allowing Khalistani militants to use the territory to make terrorist threats against India, as we have been seeing in the case of Pannun. That issue will remain, and that issue will be a drag on bilateral relations between these two countries and India.
That's why, Michael, I want your closing thoughts. Should there be any course correction by India? Because it's certainly going to damage India's international image, diminish its soft power, and even create a rift with the Western powers.
Well, I would agree with what was said before. I don't think that India's relationship with Canada can really normalize until the Trudeau government is no longer in office. I mean, we've seen that New Delhi's messaging toward Canada has been very explicit in singling out Trudeau and the Canadian government, not Canada per se. So I think that will continue to be a fraught relationship. And indeed, moving into 2025, I think that one could come to that players, except for Canada. It's a very loud exception on the Russia-China, quite frankly, and that's something that the U.S. did try to prevent. The U.S. did try to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, but indeed it's complex, and I think that relationship, that Russia-China relationship, will be a very important one to watch this coming year.
Absolutely. Many thanks to you, Michael and Professor Chelani, for joining in on that discussion. As the year ends, these crises serve as a stark reminder of the urgent need for international diplomacy, even conflict resolution, and humanitarian intervention. Without sustained efforts to address these issues, the cycle of violence is now risking to perpetuate instability and suffering well into the future. And with that, we cut to a quick break. We'll be joined in an exclusive conversation with UN's Deputy Spokesperson, Mr. Farhan Haq, who will be shedding light on 2024, the year of conflicts, crisis and displacement. Stay tuned to World 3.